right, welcome everyone. Folks are still joining us, but I don't want to wait any longer because we have a lot to hear today. I'm Heather Lazarus, and together with Julie Maldonado, serve as co-directors of the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences. And we're just really thrilled to welcome everyone to this special online event today, Testing Justice, New Ways to Address Environmental Inequalities, with our friends and inspiring leaders, Paulette Blanchard and Dr. Michelle Montgomery. Thanks so much, Paulette and Michelle, for being with us today. The Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences, for those of you who may be new to us, is housed within the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in turn managed by the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research here in Boulder, Colorado, which is where I live and work, and acknowledge that here we're on the traditional and contemporary territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute. As many of you know, the Rising Voices Center facilitates intercultural, relational-based approaches for understanding and adapting to extreme weather and climate events, climate variability, and climate change. The program brings Indigenous and other scientific professionals, tribal and community leaders, environmental and communication experts, students, educators, and artists from across the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, and the Pacific and Caribbean Islands and around the world, together to assess critical community needs and to pursue joint research aimed at developing optimal plans for community action towards sustainability and regeneration. Rising Voices acknowledges the inherent value of Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous sciences, adaptive practices and processes, and honors them equally with earth sciences. Really, at its core, Rising Voices aims to advance science through collaboration that brings Earth and Indigenous sciences into convergence, supports adaptive and resilient communities through sharing scientific capacity, and provides opportunities for Indigenous students and other career scientists through scientific and community mentoring. Central to all of this work, of this convergent science, is justice. And with that, I'll hand things over to Julie to share the Rising Voices Center's ethics guidelines and values. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today. As Heather said, I'm Julie Maldonado with the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network, which serves as the co-administrator of the Rising Voices Center. And I'm speaking to you today from the central coast of California, residing in the traditional territorial lands of the coastal Chumash. And Reed, if you can go to the next slide, please. Throughout today's event, we ask that you respect and honor the Rising Voices ethics guidelines, as these guidelines provide a starting point and considerations for good practices when working in intercultural spaces. And just so we're all on the same page, we'll read these out. That the guidelines include that we value a diversity of views and opinions, speak without judgment or argument, that we share the air, we all have something to learn and something to share, be considerate, respectful, and collaborative in speaking and listening. Please respect the diversity of knowledges articulated at all Rising Voices. Alert UCAR and CAR staff if you notice a dangerous situation or someone in distress. Meetings should take place on site or in public spaces or in virtual atmospheres. Please respect good practices for intercultural collaborations. For example, the Research Ethics, a source guide to conducting research with Indigenous peoples. Knowledge shared at RV workshops and all activities should only be used if collaborators follow the full processes of collaboration outlined in the Research Ethics, a source guide to conducting research with Indigenous people. Be respectful and aware of diverse experiences and histories, as current relationships and collaborations are shaped by settler colonial histories. And please do not appropriate or plagiarize knowledge shared during Rising Voices or future collaborations. And Heather's going to put a link in the chat to the complete ethics guidelines, so you can take a look at those. Reed, if you can go to the next slide, please. And then on a similar vein, the Rising Voices Center for Indigenous and Earth Sciences also holds the following values, which we uphold here and in all of our collective work. We work to remove the boundaries between science and society, grow a network of collaborators with diverse cultural, community, geographic, and educational backgrounds, include a diversity of views and opinions, including acknowledging the inherent value of Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous science, adaptive practices and processes. They advocate relational-based as opposed to extractive or transactional-based science. Listen, learn, and share between and across cultures and generations. Prioritize relationship building and developing trust over time. And please respect and awareness of diverse experiences and histories as current relationships and collaborations are shaped by colonial histories. And Heather's going to put a link in the chat as well for where you can access the list of the values to revisit. And so as part of our platform today, just a little kind of technology side of things, we are offering live captioning, which you have the option of turning on or off as you wish. During the question and answer portion later on, we'll ask you to either use the raise hand function, or you could like physically wave or something, or type your question in the chat. If we come to your question, we'll call on you and you may unmute at that time to ask your question. Otherwise, we do ask that you stay on mute to eliminate any background noise, and you're welcome to have your cameras on or off as you so desire. This intro and the presentation portion of the portions of the event are being recorded. However, that recording will be turned off for the question and answer portion. And so it is now with my great pleasure and honor to introduce two of our longtime mentors and teachers to many of us gathered here to get today and be well beyond the Zoom room, Paulette Blanchard and Dr. Michelle Montgomery, who will be sharing their work. Paulette on the 7 R's of Indigenous research, and on Michelle's on the eco-critical race theory, and focusing on, as they state in their published article, and we'll include a link in the chat to that article for you now, in their article, Testing Justice, New Ways to Address Environmental Inequalities. They ask the question of how can we as individuals do convergent science to address climate justice across cultures and disciplines with Indigenous peoples. So we are greatly honored to have with us today Paulette Blanchard, who is absentee Shawnee and Kickapoo, who is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at the University of Kansas. And from 2018 to 2020, she was the Diversity and Inclusion Fellow with the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. Her current work addresses Indigenous science and science education, Indigenous-led environmental movements and activism. Paulette incorporates Indigenous feminist methodologies, ethics, protocols, and philosophies into her geographic work. Her work includes social, climate, and reproductive justice for Indigenous peoples and other intersectional and marginalized populations. She has interest in how and why science education influences Native students to stay or leave academic and science spaces, as well as how mentoring contributes to their success. Paulette holds a Master of Arts in Geography from the University of Oklahoma and is a proud graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Indigenous and American Indian Studies from Haskell Indian Nations University. Her work addresses the challenges and opportunities that Indigenous peoples face in relation to climate change and climate justice. And we have with us Dr. Michelle Montgomery, who is an enrolled Haliwa Saponi descendant Eastern Band Cherokee and serves as an associate professor of American Indian Studies and Ethnic, Gender, and Labor Studies in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Tacoma. She is also the assistant director for the Office of Undergraduate Education, the Indigenous Curriculum and Community Advisor for the School of Education, and interim director for undergraduate program in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities School of Medicine. So just, a few small hats there. Dr. Montgomery's scholarship focuses on indigenizing and decolonizing the climate justice narrative through the Indigenous Speakers series, which we highly recommend tuning into if you haven't already. Environmental ethics connected to Indigenous peoples' identities, and eco-critical race theory to eliminate racial and environmental oppression. So we have a couple kind of like unicorn rock stars right here with us, and are just greatly honored to be turning it over and learning from both of them. So Paulette and Michelle, over to you.
Hello, Haki Huwesilasamamu. Thank you for having us. It's a wonderful honor and blessing to be among so many friendly faces and relatives. And And thank you for having us.
Panahipi, Pilahuk, everyone for joining us. I agree. I echo Paulette's words about having such a large family join us. And as many of us know that, we navigate our spaces, our heart work from the words we and not I, me, my. So it's truly an honor to work alongside my colleague, my best friend, my sister, all those things above. There's not enough words to really express how honored I am to do this work with family, in particular, the women who introduced us. So I want to start off our conversation by just, first of all, I want to honor your hearts and spirits. I want to honor those of us who've lost many of our relatives along the way due to the pandemic. I want to honor that many of us through this stillness are trying to find ways to dig deep, to really consider how do we bring our whole selves to justice work, and how do we do that in ways in which we don't have to change our identities, but to really be complete in this process. Which brings us to this major conversation that Paulette and I have been having for years. Who defines for whom the meaning of science? And why is it so exclusive? So we started this paper by really having these conversations through the years of who defines for whom the meaning of science, who defines for whom the meaning of education. But as fluid mixed race women, who defines for whom the meaning of the narrative? So when you look at the Western paradigm or institutions in general, part of the conversation that comes from the word science, which we really don't have that Western word in many of our languages. To us, it's our indigenous knowledges. Our knowledges are our ancestors, so we respect them that way. How do we uplift this? But at the same time, how do we bring in those intersectionalities that are often erased? For Paulette and I, but I'll speak for myself, I always come from a very strong moral compass of identifying the sum of my parts, but also asking the question always front and center, what does justice demand? And justice for many of us is going to have multiple meanings. It's going to have different layers. It's also about lived experiences. And that is place-based knowledges. It's also place-based experiences. And so when we start talking about what does justice mean, we also talked about convergent science. How do we redefine that very hard structural word of science? And words have strong meanings. And so as a critical race theorist, I want to go ahead and undemonize critical race theory. I think when people first hear critical race theory, they see, a brown mixed race person who's very proud to be alumni from a historically Black college and university, instantly say, here's the angry bumblebee, or, they see this female body of always being emotional. And so to me, critical race theory demands that we are emotional in our learning process. It demands that we honor voice. It demands that we honor lived experiences. It also demands that we honor those that are often erased. So what I mean by erase is that erasure comes in various different forms. We know that culture capital in a contemporary society, particularly in academia, the amount of grants that you actually are awarded, the amount of publications, how many presentations, how well are your discursive practices embedded in a very colonial kind of narrative, what does that mean? And to me, it doesn't have a very strong implications because, my grandfather would always remind me, you never forget where you come from. If you're going off to school and going on a journey and you can't bring that knowledge back home and share it, it's no use for us, right? That means you forgot where you came from. So when I think of what does justice demand, it's also about how do you calibrate your moral compass to always ask that question from a climate justice lens. And climate justice, from my perspective, it's so broad. And I think, I know from a Western academic institutional perspective, they put it in silos and they box it up. And then there's a particular platform in which only certain voices are allowed to speak, but it's only speak when you're told to speak and speak how we tell you to speak. And so as a critical race theorist and also a person from the South, I know firsthand what that means to be erased. I know firsthand what that means to not be acknowledged as a fluid mixed race person. I know what that means to be in academic settings when they say that using the first person I to share your story is not considered to be of academic use. So the reason why I gravitate so closely to critical race theory, and I'm all about undemonizing critical race theory, it really is about the different forms of erasure. So critical race theory says that one of the tenets, the original tenets, really talks about the conduit of voice. And from our cultural lens, voice is big, right? Voice is phenotypically who you are. Voice is the knowledges that come from the land. Voice is your bloodline, your ancestors, directly where you come from. Voice is your artistic expression, and the list goes on and on and on and on. So I would say that it's important for us when we talk about how do we decolonize the narrative, how do we recalibrate our moral compass, to always have front and center, what does justice demand? It's so important. One of my favorite persons who I would love to follow around is Dr. Cornel West. And he says that we always, when we talk about justice, it should be the service for the people. It should be the service for the people, those shoulders that we've stood on to be exactly where we are, whether they're physically present or not. Another reminder my grandfather would always say is that people have died for me to have the rights to be exactly where I am today. So thinking about critical race theory, it really is about anti-racist and anti-colonial ideals, and how do we become more inclusive? How do we become more diverse? And I think from a Western paradigm, the word inclusive and diverse means more about how do we include more female bodies? Or how do we include those that phenotypically represent the dominant culture? So from an eco-critical race theorist, I thought it was very complementary to the work that Paulette is doing, because it's truly based on eco-intersectionalities, those identities, those lived experiences. And so I'm just going to kind of go down the tenets in which I revised them. Tenet 1, I revise it to say that recognizes that environmental racism is endemic in Indigenous people's lived experiences. We can look at maps of Superfund sites and we can pretty much dictate where the Superfund sites are. And they're either on our territories, polluting our communities, in backyards of our communities, or they're part of something that's upstream that's not about when you're going to have a health disparity. Disparity is you're dealing with it right at this current point in time. Environmental racism is also connected directly to the violence against missing and murdered Indigenous women. The railroad is a contemporary revamped version now of the pipelines, right? Tenet 2 expresses skepticism toward the dominant legal claim of a post-racial society. As soon as our former president, Barack Obama, was elected as president, there's all this really weird discursive narrative saying, you see, look what, we're not racist, right? But we know the undertone of what that means. We are not in a post-racial society. We can say exactly that January 6th proved that for us. So I just want to make sure I bring that to the forefront. Tenet number 3 challenges the anthropocentric ecological ahistoricism, that humans are the epicenter of everything. And in our culture teachings, well, from where I'm from, we're the most fragile organic living being on Mother Earth. How is it that we're in 2021 and there's still folks believing that humans, which are a very small part of the ecosystem, we're the most important? And we're finding with all the climate and weather patterns that we've had a lot of things going on here in the Pacific Northwest. We've had multiple landslides, we've had heat bubbles. We know that we are extremely fragile. Number 4, insists on recognition of self-determination and sustainability. We should acknowledge that we're nations. Therefore, within nations, we have our own rights. We have a right for our own self-determination, what's right for our people. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. How do we move beyond the colonial narratives of not including that, regardless if you're state or federally recognized, or if you're Indigenous and not recognized, you still have rights as nation to nation. Number 5, Indigenous knowledges are interdisciplinary with a collective responsibility. And it goes back to, there's an inherent amount of responsibility with knowledge. knowledge also comes with the ask. And when people ask me to do things, or ask me specific questions, I do a gentle pushback because I want to call them into a conversation. And that's another thing that eco-critical race theory does. We're calling people into a conversation. And the question is, are you ready for the response to the ask? So our indigenous knowledges say that we have a responsibility to the knowledge systems because we've been gifted the knowledge with the understanding that knowledge is only important in the ways in which we share it, the ways in which we respect our knowledges as our elders. And the last tenet works toward eliminating racial and environmental oppression of indigenous peoples' lands and seascapes. And that's also all a part of ending all oppression. So it's just not focused on a particular race group. And the other part of eco-critical race theory is, race is a prefabricated word. It was a word that was developed based on the genocide of indigenous peoples and using Black and brown bodies as slaves. It's a culture capital. They put us in these ledgers like we were agriculture components. And so when we unpack what it means to be race, when we unpack what it means to be oppressed, when we unpack all the various forms of erasure that happens with climate justice, there's some really important conversations that we need to have. So my question to the audience is, how do we call each other into a conversation with grace and humility? How do we call each other into a conversation by acknowledging the first peoples of the lands in which you walk on, regardless if it's a city or a rural area, it's all stolen land from indigenous peoples. How do we acknowledge that? How do we acknowledge the healing from residential boarding schools? How do we get to a point where we talk about how do we recreate relationships to place? How do we recreate relationships with the communities around us? And how do we recalibrate our moral compass to ask the question, what does justice demand? But what Dr. Daniel Wildcat always talk about is, how are we a good ancestor? And Dr. Robin Kimmier also asked the question of, what type of human being do you want to be remembered as? And so in the work Paula and I have done collaboratively really is hitting on a lot of these really strong points of erasure, recalibrating your moral compass, calling people into a conversation, and really naming the things that must be worked on, while at the same time acknowledging that there are allies, right? But first and foremost, our indigenous knowledges are not meant to be part of an extra add-on. Our indigenous knowledges have been here since time immemorial. And so when you really get back to that question about justice, is when do we get to a point when we call each other into a conversation where we all find common synergies, but common synergies to acknowledge that we all have lived experiences and different ways of navigating place. So I'll stop there to leave the platform open to Paulette.
Thank you so much. And with that, that foundation really became a catalyst and supported the work that I was working on parallel to Michelle. And when we started listening more to each other's talks, it made sense that she's providing this framework, this foundation. And I essentially had built on other work to create the tools that which you can apply this, we know the so what, now what. So these 7 R's that came up, 4 of them were, I had first come across in some work by Margaret Kovac in her book, Indigenous Methodologies. And she had found them in Burkhart and Kirkness, an article on Indigenous education. And so the first 4 R's come from, the work from others who have done looked at how some of the most important protocols and etiquettes, I guess, that should be applied to Indigenous education systems that Margaret Kovac expanded into Indigenous methodologies. And I've expanded more into methods. So I've added 3 more to these 7 R's. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see here. So I also want to acknowledge, here's the citation for this article that Heather put in the chat earlier. Maybe she would share it again so that people that have come in late might have an opportunity to see that. So in the 7 R's I came up with, relationship was one of the original ones. And when we talk about relationship, it's not just in Western science, relationships are considered a bias, but for Indigenous people, relationships, not having that relationship is a bias. Relationship, it takes work. And like any relationship, there's work, and relationships are more than just between human beings, but they are between humans and human beings. And they all require a certain amount of respect, understanding, nurturing, and care. And we all know that if we care for something, it thrives. If you care for place thrives. And so this incorporates, food, shelter, water, and other necessities needed to thrive. So relationships are interactive and not limited to human. There are relationships between animals and plants, plants and humans, plants and other plants. And all of these relationships are of a reciprocity and an interdependence. So there exists a relationship of reciprocity between all entities of place. In relationship, there has to be purpose. There has to be relevance, care, and opportunities to thrive and grow. So when approaching and working with Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, Indigenous methodologies and theories, relationship is critical, and relationships have to be built, and they're not always going to be easy, and they're not always going to work. And having that respect, which will go into the second R, that respect carries its own weight on so many levels. Respect of Indigenous people's cultural integrity is important. Respecting the fact that they are all unique and all different, and there's not a Native American per se in the United States of this idea of pan-Indianism, but respect not just as individuals, but fundamentally as a people. And we are expected to leave our cultural predispositions of our own worlds at the door and assume the trapping of a new reality, which is often substantially different from our own. So when we work with science, it's often in an opposing worldview, and it becomes challenging. So it's important to understand that Indigenous peoples, you come in with a certain amount of respect for them as sovereign nations, respect for their spirituality, to their place connectedness, their histories, their culture, their protocols and ethics, having enough respect to adhere and learn and apply their protocols and their ethics for their communities, even learning some of their language so that you can be respectful of that, respecting the land, respecting the individual and the community, respecting that they are sovereign and that there is gender fluidity that will vary from community to community, and that consent and trust have to be built, because consultation does not equate to consent. And that's something that science historically has gotten wrong. And not just science, but government to government relationships. Tribes are land-based people who each have nation-to-nation relationships with all the federal, state, and other tribes. Most traditional knowledges and science predate America by thousands of years. So it's important to have that humility and be respectful of the peoples and the more than human relatives that encompass the relationships of place. And then the next is reciprocity. Reciprocity is the giving back to, and it doesn't mean just giving back to a person or to a community, but giving back to place. What are you bringing back to this relationship? There has to be a relationship or a reciprocity created in ways that are appropriate to the participants and individual and community needs or requests, such as contributing your time and labor to assist in a community project, or maybe what the community might need. Bringing food when you come to visit, or just simple things, because oftentimes scientists and researchers just show up and expect these communities to somehow or another contribute to supporting them somehow because, you know, they're there or something, or they think that, you know, they're excited to share their stories. But there's been thousands, you know, hundreds of years and thousands of scientists and researchers that have showed up in community and created great harm. So it's important that you understand the reciprocity you bring is appropriate and relevant and makes sense to the needs of these peoples in these communities. How does your work benefit the people in place? Does your work give back to the community? Are they included in the development of the questions, the methods, and the collection of data? If you're asking for information or access to information or access to a place, what are you giving in return? Does your work empower the community and make their lives better? According to who? Who decides? And who owns that data? Data sovereignty is important, and they have the right to own their own information, their own stories. So after reciprocity naturally folds right into responsibility. Michelle spoke to the importance of responsibility having, you know, knowledge having a responsibility. And it's not just the responsibility, it's the accountability to that responsibility too. Knowledge has responsibilities, and one extra part of responsibility is accountability. The days of dropping into a community and extracting information and leaving to never return is gone. There's so much knowledge not for outsiders, and researchers must just accept this and support Indigenous rights to own their own knowledges. As the researcher must be accountable and respectful of where you are and be mindful that you are a visitor. You are not allowed to publish whatever you feel like, because some information can be detrimental to the people you're working with. You're responsible to empower, not to hurt and to violate peoples and places with your research, your methods, your analysis, and your assumptions. If your work doesn't center the community and place needs, why are you doing the work, and who is benefiting? So being responsible, just a reminder, it's not all information and knowledges are for consumption. Knowledge is responsibility, not power. They're not synonymous. Accountability is part of the responsibility to place and to each other. The next R is relevance. The work you do, is it relevant? Does it help? Is there purpose to it? There must be purpose for what is studied and what is learned. Purpose and relevance to the community, to the people, to the place, to the next generation, to the land, to the more than human beings. And yes, relevance to science. You know, science needs to also have some relevance, you know, so that the work is rigorous and so that it can be redistributed into academic spaces in ways that both support expanding knowledge, shared production of knowledge, but also shared credit for knowledge. So the relevance of the work that you do can't just be curiosity's sake or doing science for the sake of science, but when you're working with an Indigenous community, it's important that the work matters and supports and empowers them and contributes to their success and to the thriving of the humans and the more than human beings of place. So relatedness. Relatedness is important because it's one of those ones that science would never consider and often is absent of, which relatedness is kind of the spirituality or the metaphysical components of knowledge and physics, I guess you could say, because Indigenous people recognize that there is a relatedness to all things because we have hydrogen and oxygen, we have minerals in our bodies, we have iron, we have magnesium, we have calcium, we have things in our body that can be found in the soils, can be found in the plants and animals, can be found in our environment. So we clearly are of this environment. We are not separate and above it or outside of it. So meaning that puts us in a finite system of the larger component of the earth and its environmental dynamic systems. So to recognize these relatedness, that, you know, you have to acknowledge the connectedness of beings of place and the relationships of reciprocity that exists between these entities of place. What appears to be chaos is often collaboration between species. Systems and patterns are the way of life. Western science often will see an outlier and discredit it as unimportant or a mistake or something that must be wrong. Indigenous science often looks at these outliers as evolution, revolution. These are where the unique opportunities can happen of place, and we might want to pay attention to those things because we already understand the patterns. We have worked with and studied and been part of patterns for so many thousands of years that it's the outliers we often look to. So making sure that you recognize all things are related, and things like water and rock have essences that can be considered life, because energy, any measurable energy, that electron that moves is life. And so that takes us down to redistribution. How are things being translated and shared? How are the products that are the deliverables of place and what we've learned and the stories that we have come up with in our research? How are they being brought back to the community in ways that inform and that make sense and that can be translated and passed on to their children and grandchildren? So information learned must be shared so that all of the community can access it, understand it, and implement what is learned into their lives as it is useful to them. Information must be in a format that is appropriate for them and their systems of knowledge exchanges, and is transmittable easily across generations and is exchangeable with other neighboring communities. Mixed media has become a really unique way for people to share stories, and I've seen some stories be put in picture, like in I don't want to call them cartoons, but in illustrations. I've seen stories be put in art. I've seen woven baskets that incorporate a story of the evolution of something. And so making sure that what you put together and have accumulated that has become this knowledge base or this new information is written in their language, or can be shared as art or pictures or a painting, a song, a dance, some type of story or storytelling that is shareable, that is useful, that is relevant to them and their peoples and place, and can be utilized in a way that will inform the next generation and exchange these ideas and information so that the next generation can thrive, take what they can use of that information and thrive. So with that, I will stop sharing and see if we might have some questions for Michelle or myself.